Hello and welcome back to Whys of History, where we have history degrees here, I promise. This is part 2 of episode 5 on why Russia invaded Ukraine/annexed Crimea. Today, let's focus more on the rough and tumble history between Russia and Ukraine. If you want to get caught up on the issue or see Sam's glorious face, you can click over here. If you're more curious on why Crimea is messed up in this whole thing, you can click over here. But before we dive too much into the history that informs this current event, let's hit our
randomly relevant random fact
for today. So if you've been following the English-speaking news much, you might have noticed that there's often two ways of referring to the country we're about to talk about this episode: Ukraine and the Ukraine. It may seem a somewhat semantic or meaningless distinction, but it is one that underlines a lot of the history we're about to hit here. So the word/term/name Ukraine is generally thought to be rooted in Ukraina, which was an old Slavic word for borderlands, more or less, as at one point the area around Kiev that we now call Ukraine was the borderlands between the kingdoms of Poland, Lithuania, the various Cossack and steppe peoples in southern Russia, and Russia itself. The linguistic origin is somewhat debated, as some scholars believe the name Ukraine means something to the effect of territory or homeland. In any case, the use of the article "the" in front of Ukraine denoted it as a territory or region rather than a country, akin to the Midwest or the Sudetenland. As Ukraine was basically under Russian control for hundreds of years, Ukraine has generally been referred to as the Ukraine, denoting that it was a region rather than a country. With Ukrainian independence in 1991, the Ukrainian government officially asked that the article be dropped, as Ukraine wanted to emphasize its place as an independent Ukrainian state. In fact, many Ukrainians find the use of the article offensive or problematic, as it harkens back to a time when they were simply a territory of Greater Russia and not their own country. Since Ukrainian independence, the vast majority of the English-speaking world, politically and academically speaking, has dropped the article, and in general, dude, the Ukraine is not the preferred nomenclature. This argument takes a bit of a different form in Russia and Ukraine themselves, as articles don't exist in the Russian or Ukrainian language. This distinction between Ukraine as a country and Ukraine as a region does exist in Russian/Ukrainian, but it involves far too many Russian prepositions and Cyrillic letters and hard to pronounce words that I'm going to avoid the details and simply leave you with a link in the description. Part 1. So Jordan, sounds like Russia and Ukraine have quite a history then. Why, yes they do, me, and what a great, if ham-fisted way to transition us into some history. So going way back, the countries we call Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine all more or less trace their lineage to a single entity, the Kievan Rus, a Middle Ages kingdom centered around Kiev that covered chunks of Far Eastern Europe and Western Russia that was ultimately destroyed by the Mongols in the 1200s CE. The fact that these three countries were once unified has not been forgotten, and is a big part of particularly Russian national history and heritage. After this point, what would become Ukraine was largely controlled by other kingdoms like Poland, Lithuania, and was often known as Little Russia, with actual Russia being known as Greater Russia, and Belarus known as White Russia. In 1654, actual Russia, then known as Muscovy, and the Cossack leaders of Ukraine agreed to unify Ukraine and Russia with the Treaty of Pereyaslav, ending mostly Polish domination of Ukraine in favor of mostly Russian domination. This mostly Russian domination would more or less continue up until the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, with some noteworthy events we're definitely going to cover. Firstly, it's worth noting that there are many instances of independence and revolt by Ukraine over the last 800 years, so it's not like the Ukrainian people just sat around while their country got repeatedly controlled. However, it wouldn't be until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that a truly Ukrainian identity began to form, which was centered around Ukrainian language and the shared history of all those rebellions over the last few hundred years. By the turn of the 20th century, Ukraine was mostly still under the control of the Russian Empire, with pieces of the modern-day state administered by Austria-Hungary. This meant that when World War I broke out, Ukrainians fought on both sides, and during the Russian Communist Revolution/Civil War that followed, Ukraine saw a brief flash of independence in the midst of its own multi-faction civil war. However, this independence didn't win the day, and the territory of Ukraine was split again between a bunch of different powers. If that wasn't enough, Ukraine would later become one of the founding members of the USSR. The interwar period was no better for Ukraine, as it saw what is known as the Holodomor in 1932 through 33, which has casualty estimates that range from 2 to 10 million people. Depending on who you ask, this was A, particularly bad natural famine, B, a natural famine that the Soviet government failed to adequately prepare for, C, a famine that was the adverse result of Stalin and the USSR's brand new collectivization policies, D, the deliberate attempts of Stalin and the leadership of the USSR to crush Ukrainian nationalism and spirit by starving millions of them to death, or E, some combination of those. While historians fall across the spectrum on this issue, this event remains a sticking point in Ukrainian and Russian relations, as the arguably intentional starvation of millions in the so-called breadbasket of Eastern Europe is not something easily forgotten. During World War II, Ukraine was one of the first Soviet territories to be taken by the Nazis on the Eastern Front. The Battle of Kiev in 1941 was a disaster for the Soviet Red Army, and the city was left utterly ruined by the fighting. Many in Ukraine welcomed Nazi occupation as an alternative to Soviet oppression, though the Nazis proved to be just as brutal as the Soviets, and Ukraine suffered immensely throughout the war. Ukraine would ultimately make a remarkable comeback in the post-war period and gained independence with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. Now, there are two post-independence events in Ukrainian history I want to hit before we get into the current event, both of which play a big role in understanding the mess as we have it thus far. With the collapse of the USSR, Ukraine was left with a massive stockpile of Soviet nuclear weapons when it became independent. So in 1994, Russia, Ukraine, the United Kingdom, and the United States signed the Budapest Memorandum, essentially agreeing to respect Ukraine's newfound sovereignty and independence in exchange for the dismantling of Ukraine's newfound nuclear stockpile. While this agreement is considered international law, there are no explicit requirements that anyone must aid Ukraine if it is broken, only that the signing countries agreed not to mess with Ukraine. Russia's recent actions seem to indicate that it has gone back on this agreement, and Putin actually argued that the overthrow of the Yanukovych government meant a new Ukraine has been created, therefore none of Russia's previous agreements are valid. The other event I want to touch on is the Orange Revolution, which occurred in late 2004 to 2005 and involves many of the same themes and even people with our most recent event. The revolution began with accusations of election fraud in November of 2004, when Viktor Yanukovych was declared victorious over opposition candidate Viktor Yushchenko, despite exit polls giving Yushchenko a notable lead. Over the next few weeks, peaceful protests engulfed Kiev, as thousands wore orange and waved orange flags in support of Yushchenko. Countless pieces of evidence came to light proving blatant election fraud by Yanukovych, who was generally supported by the corrupt elites in Ukraine as well as the generally pro-Russian factions. The election was eventually ruled invalid, and Yushchenko was, under the watch of thousands of international observers, elected the third president of Ukraine. Not only did the successful defense of the democratic process set the groundwork for the Euromaidan protests in 2014, but it is emblematic of a bigger issue within Ukraine itself. Part 2. The current event. The long history of Russian domination and control has left its mark on Ukraine, and this history is something that the country still struggles with today. Not only is the idea of a Ukrainian nationality fairly muddled, but historically Ukraine was often a territory to be gobbled up whenever the nearby powers got hungry. On top of that, centuries of Russian rule and interaction ingrained the Russian language and culture into much of the country, though a fair amount of that Russian influence and language and people came from the forcible deportations of Ukrainians and the forced immigrations of Russians that was common throughout the Soviet era. This leaves us with a Ukraine that is fairly distinctly split between those who speak Ukrainian, generally located in the west, and those who speak Russian, generally located in the east. However, it gets even more complicated. You have Russian-speaking Ukrainians who see themselves as Ukrainian, as well as Russian-speaking Ukrainians who see themselves as ethnically Russian. The issue of language remains a huge part of Ukrainian politics, as some believe that Ukrainian should be the only language of Ukraine, whereas others believe that the wide presence of Russian speakers means that Russian should be another official language as well. The divide between the Russian-speaking and Russian-leaning Ukrainians and the Ukrainian-speaking and Ukrainian-leaning Ukrainians has come up time and time again after independence, and the most recent events are not an exception. Yanukovych was generally pro-Russian and was elected on the backs of the Russian-speaking people in the eastern end of the country, but was overthrown and replaced by generally Ukrainian-speaking, pro-Ukrainian factions and protesters in the West. As the new government tries to figure itself out, pro-Russian separatists have started popping up in eastern Ukraine, both in protest of the new pro-Western government and in hopes that their plight will attract more direct intervention or pressure from Russia itself, who use the defense of ethnically and linguistically Russian people as their justification for invading Crimea. The separatists view the overthrow of the Yanukovych regime as an illegal coup and don't trust the people who have created the replacement government, people who have been painted as fascists and radicals by certain parts of Ukrainian and Russian media. Part 3. Moral of the story. Moral of the story is, this situation is extremely tricky. Were the Euromaidan protests led by selfless revolutionaries fighting against a corrupt leader who deliberately defied the will of his people? Or were they rioters who toppled a democratically elected president because they didn't like one of his decisions? There's bits of truth in both here, and truth is an extremely rare commodity, as propaganda on all sides of this issue has reached levels not seen in quite a long time. Many articles you can read about this issue called the Crimea/Ukraine crisis the biggest East versus West conflict since the Cold War, and it certainly does seem like the sides have been drawn here. Western leaders and media have pretty overwhelmingly been in support of the Euromaidan protesters, preferring the freedom fighters toppling a corrupt leader narrative, while Russian media tends to focus more on the illegitimate coup of a democratically elected leader by a bunch of radical revolutionaries angle. Many have argued that the expansion of the EU and NATO into Eastern Europe has provoked Russia and led to a lot of animosity between East and West. In fact, Ukraine is often noted as one of the few ex-Soviet Eastern European countries that retained its close ties to Russia and didn't just jump ship to NATO or the EU like Estonia or Poland. This isn't just Jordan rambling either. Much of Putin's rhetoric contains this idea of East versus West, and the initial uprisings in Ukraine that sparked this whole endeavor focused on forging greater ties with the West at the expense of the East. Russia seems prepared to take a diplomatic and economic hit from the West in exchange for retaining some control over its backyard. A wise Sam once told me,
Hey Jordan, be sure to put in something about history repeating itself and how that applies here.
and I think we'll end this epic with that idea. The fact that Ukraine is trying to decide its own destiny in the face of a powerful Russia is not new. The fact that Crimea is being manhandled for its geopolitical value and with little regard to its current inhabitants is not new. The fact that West and East are struggling over who gets influence over Central and Eastern Europe is not new. The fact that one man's freedom fighter is another man's radical revolutionary is certainly not new. And the fact that hundreds of years of complicated history have created a complicated present that might take hundreds of years to fix is not new. So while many aspects of this conflict very much reflect the present, the soul of this issue very much lies in the past. Thank you very much for watching. If you got questions, concerns, philosophical discussions, corrections, please throw those in a comment or check out our Facebook page. It's pretty cool, I promise. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate your time. I'm Professor Jordan, and I will see you all next class.
The microphone, I have some kind of furry leopard-spotted cat toy here. What is the historic significance of this, you might be wondering? Nothing at all.